What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Trap Fish Aquatics. Today I'm going to be talking about how to set up a quarantine tank and why you should set one up. Okay, so quarantine tanks. In my opinion, quarantine tanks are an extremely important part of your hobby, being a fish keeper. If you only have one tank, be it a 10-gallon tank like this, even just that, I think you should have a quarantine tank. Me personally, I run 5.5-gallon quarantine tanks because that cuts down on the cost of medicine and it cuts down on the cost of treating fish for longer periods of time. Generally speaking, a lot of medicines that you would use in quarantine, like general cure for parasites or erythromycin for bacterial and fungal infections, are dosed per 10 gallons per packet. So that means you'd be able to use one packet for 2 treatments. So that's why I like my 5.5-gallon tanks. But you can do one bigger. 10 gallons work just as well, mainly because medicines are specifically set for 10 gallons. So 10-gallon quarantine tanks are good also. Now, how to set up a quarantine tank? I get asked this a lot, and people assume that there's a lot to it because it's a hospital tank. And when people hear the word hospital, they automatically assume that there's a lot involved. And quarantine tanks are extremely easy to set up. It's probably going to be the easiest tank you've ever set up in your life, because you basically take a tank, fill it with water, put a filter on it, put a heater on it, and that's it. That's bare minimum. That's all you need is filtration and a heater. And you don't even have to have them cycled most of the time, because a lot of the medications that you're going to use, like erythromycin, if you dose a little bit too much of it, or if you have a weak cycle, it's going to end up killing the beneficial bacteria anyway. So you don't necessarily have to have the tanks cycled. I don't have mine cycled. I just have them set up here and just let the sponge filters run, right? And they don't have to cost a lot to run either. So my 5.5 gallons run on sponge filters, and if I just ran the sponge filter and the heaters that are in them are 50 watts, and you don't have to run the heater unless there's fish in it. So I don't, and then I just run the sponge filter while nothing's in it and just let the sponge filter run, because the air pump driving the sponge filter is only 5 watts, which costs me literally nothing. It's less than 50 cents a month to run, so I don't care if it's running and there's nothing in it. If something gets sick or injured, go ahead, throw it in there, turn the heater on if you need it, and then you're good to go. Now, as far as heaters go, you are going to want an adjustable. Don't get a preset one. You want something with some adjustment. That way, if you get any kind of infections that are going to need heat, like ick, if you get a tank that has ick and you only have one fish in there and you're able to quarantine it, so say if my red devil up here, he's by himself in a 55-gallon tank, if he was to get ick, instead of treating the entire tank, I would just move him down to the 5.5-gallon and treat him there. So you're going to want to have a heater that you're going to be able to turn up, get the water up to like 86 degrees for that, treat him for ick, get him good, and by the time you get him back in the tank, the ick will have died off if there was any left in the tank, because they only survive for 24 hours. So that's pretty much it to set up a quarantine tank. It's extremely easy. Just tank, filtration, heater, and you're good to go. Then you just stock up on the medications that you need. Generally, I keep on hand erythromycin, general cure, Ick-X, and aquarium salt. And that's all I use. That's all I use in the fish room for treating any kind of infections or parasites I get, because generally speaking, on the whole, those medications will treat 99% of things that you're going to come across. So now that we've talked a little bit about how to set up a quarantine tank, I want to talk a little bit about why you should set up a quarantine tank. And you really should set up a quarantine tank anytime you go out and get new fish, right? You're going to want it for that. Because in my experience, I have lost quite a bit of fish before I decided that quarantine tanks were a good idea. For example, this 55-gallon tank right here, I had probably about 200 guppies in here. And that might seem like a lot for a 55-gallon, but it really isn't, because the amount of plants and everything I have in here, and all I run filtration-wise is a sponge filter. So the plants took care of most of the filtration, and the sponge filter basically polished the water. It never got cloudy, never had spikes of ammonia or nitrites or nitrates or anything like that. Everything was good, right? I maintained it very well. But what was happening is I had 75% of these fish were males, and if you know anything about guppies, if you have a lot of males, they're going to pick and beat on each other, trying to spawn with the females to basically gain territory, right? So they're really beating on each other. So I went out and I like, you know what, I'm going to get like 20 or 30 more females, get them in there, try and quell that down a little bit. And then once I got the females in there, I was going to go in and sort out a bunch of the males and then sell them off. It was going to be about a week before I could get down to the local fish store to sell them off. So that's just what was happening, because where I was getting the females from is not where I sell them to. Because otherwise I would just be buying my own fish. So I went and got the females. I didn't quarantine. I put them in here, and lo and behold, they had some kind of internal parasites that essentially wiped out the entire stock of my tank except for about 10 of my fish. So I lost a lot of my fish, and it was really upsetting. So I basically had to start over, and that all could have been prevented if I quarantined beforehand. So now I quarantine every single fish that I get, whether it's before a new tank, going into a pre-existing tank with other fish. It doesn't matter. If a new fish enters this fish room, it goes into quarantine, because I do not want to lose more fish again because of that reason. Now, there are other things that you could have happen where you're going to end up losing fish, like aggression and things like that. But specifically, we're just talking about medical issues and things like that that are going to cause you to have loss. Another reason that you're going to want to have a quarantine tank set up is if you get a fish that gets specifically ill. So in my tank of goldfish here, for example, one of my goldfish had an eye injury. The eye began to swell. It got a bacterial and a fungal infection on it, and before anything happened and it could potentially spread to other fish, I got that fish out, quarantined, healed the eye, and was able to return that fish back into the tank without risking injury or ailment to any of my other fish. And that's one of the very key points of having a quarantine tank, is being able to do stuff like that. Because it's a lot easier to treat one fish on its own in a smaller tank than it is to treat one fish with a whole bunch of other fish in a much larger tank. It's cheaper and it's a lot easier, and that's why I love quarantine tanks. I highly recommend one to everybody. If you're concerned on the cost of a quarantine tank, you can go out to a pet store. I know Pet Supplies Plus, if you have one near you, sells these 5.5 gallon tanks for about $12. That's not on sale either. That's just off the shelf pricing. It's about 12 to 15 bucks. And then a sponge filter's $5. So for the cost of $20, you can get yourself an air pump, a sponge filter, a 5.5 gallon tank, and then an adjustable heater that's a small one. So maybe 30 bucks, you can set up a small quarantine tank, and you're pretty much good to go for any issues that you might have in the future, whether it be in a fish room like this or in your favorite 10-gallon tank and your one guppy, is having some troubles. So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. Thank you for watching Try Fish Aquatics, and I will see you guys in the next one.